Well, thank you for the kind invitation to be here. I'm going to present some findings from a series of studies across the 15 years funded by the NIH, and also perceptions that we've gathered by doing these studies and being out in the community. Could I have a slide, please? Well, the first question that comes to mind is why use schools to increase physical activity for children. And I think the most obvious reason is that the children are at the schools 9 to 10 months of the year, somewhere between 85 and 90% of all school-age children. Schools have mandates, statements, mission statements that include a variety of health activities, including physical activity. And one of the things that has been developed in the last 10 or 15 years is a series of investigations to see if physical activity is not only tied to health, which obviously it is, but also academic achievement, which schools are primarily charged with and interested in. The physical infrastructure is in place, sort of a protected environment. Now, when I was a kid, which is some time ago, we played all over the place, the neighborhood. Parents were quite comfortable with us half a mile away at a ball field or what have you. School represents a somewhat protected environment. One can argue even some of the worst schools are better than some of the worst neighborhoods. Slide, please. There is supervision in place. And so there's various levels of administration, obviously teachers and so forth. I think one of the most important things is that it's a reasonably educated workforce and they're already salaried. So the question is, what do they provide? And if you choose to provide physical activity, there's really no additional cost. And I think no additional cost is relatively crucial. There's a number of other systems too. We're currently working with extension services in the state of Kansas, and it's the same situation where they have a staff that's already salaried. It's just a matter of what they choose to deliver. With teachers, I think teachers still, although there's more turmoil now than there was when I was young, I generally respected in elementary school children, which is what we deal with, generally follow directions. This may erode as children go to junior high and high school, but in elementary school, a teacher pretty much rules the roost. And if we want to continue these beyond the research phase, we're all familiar with funded studies. When the funding ends, the intervention ends. However, schools are pretty entrenched. I don't think they're going anywhere. The way they deliver their services changes all the time, which I'll speak to later on as a big challenge, but they're still going to be there. Slide, please. Now, schools historically are sedentary. My children grew up in Kearney, Nebraska, which is a town of about 25,000. And I lived about 4.5 miles from town out in the country, if you will, and they rode a bus 60 minutes each way, which is also a sedentary behavior. If they walked briskly, they probably could have made it in the same time, 60 minutes each way. Recess in physical education has declined and arguably cannot provide an adequate stimulus for fitness or to protect against fatness or increasing levels of overweight and obesity. Unfortunately, many studies have shown that in physical education, sometimes in a 30-minute period, the moderate activity levels are only several minutes due to organizational problems, equipment, space, and so forth, not always a teacher problem. In a school, motor time off task is discouraged and disciplined, and the traditional paradigm is sit down and be quiet. So this is essentially a sedentary environment. Slide, please. So when we thought about this, that's still being encouraged because the kids are in school. Um, how could we impact overweight and obesity by increasing physical activity? Obviously, there's other things, diet and so forth, which we've also done. But cardiovascular fitness in particular and physical activity, of course, are linked with fitness or with body fat and overweight and obesity. And fitness, activity, and body fat are linked with cognitive function. At least most evidence points that some is neutral. That's studies, right? If you do 10 studies, they won't all come out alike. And cognitive function is linked with academic achievement. And again, this is back to the primary purpose of a school. So we're looking for leverage. We're looking for a sales pitch, if you will, to promote these in the academic environment. So this is sort of the model, very simple, easy to understand, that explains how interjecting increased physical activity uh, might not only help with health outcomes, but also uh, intrigue the academic side as well, given that's what schools are charged with. Slide, please. So we came up with this idea called physical activity across the curriculum. It's really just a stolen idea from, math across the curriculum, writing across the curriculum, and so forth. It actually came from my wife, who's 45, 46 year school teacher, and we thought we could do the same. The same idea if we could get this infused in the regular classroom. Slide, please. So here are the aims that we started out with. And the premise was to use increase physical activity by using classroom teachers to teach existing lessons. So we felt this was important in that we didn't want to appear to be coming in from the outside and say, do this and do that. Just whatever your current lessons are fine, but teach them with physical activity or through physical activity. So that's different from an activity break. An activity break has no overt purpose in terms of dovetailing with the academic agenda. And if you teach through physical activity, there's no decrease in academic instruction time. So this was, we thought, another selling point might appeal to administrators and teachers alike. When we did our first studies and the objectives have changed across the 3 studies we've done, but diminish increases in BMI, determine associations between the active lessons and academic achievement, and describe time on task with the idea that if time on task increases, perhaps academic achievement will increase as well. So you can see here, these are selling points. We hope that these were selling points to administration and teachers alike. Slide, please. So this is a minimal intervention and is different than other approaches, which is fine, where they're more comprehensive. That is, they intend to change the school environment at virtually every level. And this has some appeal too. It's sort of like, making so many opportunities for physically active that almost like a diffuse molecule, at some point it will land. It will land on a place where physical activity takes place. We took the opposite approach, minimal intervention, rather than perhaps overwhelming the system. And it's probably just, pick what works for you. Enhanced learning, no additional teacher prep time. And if you've worked with teachers, this is almost the holy grail. If they perceive that this is going to increase their prep time, I don't think you have a whole lot of chance of penetrating the system. From the administrative side, if you have a lot of additional costs, likewise, I think you have little chance of penetrating the system. Even reasonably funded schools don't have a whole lot of extra money floating around. we wanted something that could be perpetuated and replicated, that it wasn't so complicated that only 1 out of every 10 or 100 schools could do. Fun would be nice if, it's very difficult to get people to do things that they really, really don't want to do repetitively. And another difference with this approach from other approaches is that within reason, the students must participate. So if the classroom teacher in elementary school has pretty good uh, control of the classroom, when they say do X, I mean, 95% of the students are going to do X. So it's really everybody participates rather than recess where somebody walks over, sits against the building, and they just chat or what have you. Slide, please. Our approach was 10 minutes of physical activity for a total of 90 to 100 minutes a week. We sort of pushed one in the morning, one in the afternoon. That's quickly deteriorated toward to do it whenever you can, because the classroom day to day varies. We thought language, math, science, history would be the easiest, but it turned out it probably just was up to the teacher to be creative as to what subject matter most easily translated. Slide, please. So with Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong. So rather than trying to interject a loop of film, I just took some still pictures, well, from a long time ago. And I'm sure you get the idea of an active lesson. The kids are up, they're moving, doing simple movements and so forth. You notice that the desks have not been moved. They all have their own space. This is actually also a concern of teachers when you first approach them. This is going to be chaos. People will be banging into one another, things of that nature. Back when I was a kid, actually, we used to clear the classroom, move our desks, and do various things from time to time. I don't think that's well tolerated anymore. Slide, please. So this is another example, and this was Spanish, and I could never, I don't know what this teacher did. I'm very creative because I can see certain things, learning math, hop on numbers, 2 kids run to the corner, 2 kids run to the other corner, 2 and 2 is 4. I mean, but I don't know how she did this, but this was one of the most active classes that we had. Slide, please. And so PAC was successful in the sense of improving physical activity for schools that were cluster randomized to either intervention or control. And we did this by direct observation using a tool called SOFIT. There's various iterations of this. It's just a moment sampling whereby you observe what students are doing in response to the teacher's instructions. And we do this semester by, across semester. All of the PAC studies are 3-year interventions, so they're not short term. And out of a 5-point scale, we get about 3.5, which means that there was considerable activity. It corresponds to walking, hopping, leaping type activities that will expend energy and in theory could induce fitness and perhaps impact academic achievement. Slide, please. The time on task is something that teachers are constantly concerned about. And this is a slide from a colleague of mine, Mahar, out at San Diego. This was originally done at East Carolina University in a similar program called Energizers. And the idea is if you do these physical activity sessions, will the kids be more attentive or less attentive subsequently? When you speak to teachers about physical activity in the classroom, they're concerned about equally 50-50, some realization that there's quite a bit of evidence that if kids are physically active later on, they're calmer, got a little bit of the energy out, if you will. But there's also equal concern that they just won't calm down and they'll be more hyped up than they were before. And this would impact time on task. Will they pay attention? Will they be doing what they're supposed to be doing? I think the preponderance of evidence is that they'll have greater time on task, although I think the literature in bulk is controversial. But this also is a point that you need to sell if you take the classroom physical activity approach. Slide, please. So really, all in all, what's needed to promote non-traditional physical activity in schools? I think the number one thing that would make these programs low cost and sustainable is university teacher preparation, which, as far as we can tell, is universally absent in a meaningful way. So I'll make the analogy. I don't want to gore anyone's ox, but in medical school, nutrition is probably a lecture. It's not a course or a series or a month or what have you. At universities, the delivery, organization, the skills necessary to promote physical activity in the classroom is almost non-existent. University of Kansas actually has done some of this, but again, it's not enough to change the culture of the average classroom teacher that recognizes that this is normal and that they will be expected and required to do this in the classroom. So add universal curriculum for teaching, I think would be the cheapest, most effective way. We have to keep the teacher burden low for lesson preparation. And although for those of us that promote physical activity think that, well, certainly you can convert your existing lesson to physical activity, the teachers recognize this as burdensome. The skills that you promote have to be very simple, disconnected from any sort of motor skill sport type activity. And we continue to need the accumulation of evidence that physical activity and fitness will in fact promote learning, because again, this is the number one issue. I do think there are plausible biological markers, especially from the cognitive function folks. Chuck Hellman up at Northeastern University is a leader in the field. And if you have some of these things, you may have a chance at policy change. And if the policy doesn't change, I think the probability of widespread dissemination of these programs is not good. Slide, please. So globally, how can you target this? Increase the time children are physically active in physical education and recess. I've mentioned previously that studies that observe moderate to vigorous physical activity in physical education classes is incredibly disappointing. And so they're already there. So if you can enrich the amount of time that they are in fact active, that's certainly an approach, and it takes nothing away from academic instruction because it's already there. Before and after physical activity schools, active transportation, which I think is very promising, although it's very difficult to organize because you rely on volunteers. This is where people do walking school buses. And so you gather kids as they go through the various neighborhoods, and parents who volunteer lead them to school, which adds on, it could be a couple of blocks, or if the first kid picked up, it could add on a half a mile. Of course, physically active lessons, which ours approach. And again, the controversy of, is it a management and behavior tool? And so our experience is that it generally is, but our experience is also that teachers initially have anxiety. Slide, please. I don't know if the support in the schools is really there. If you take a look at, the probability of policy change when the schools do not require this very much at all. The green bars are the requirement, the blue are recommended. So if you want policy change, there has to be support, and it's a little bit questionable whether or not that support exists. Slide, please. So here's some issues I think that we want to consider that globally across the various studies um, that have sort of come to the forefront. And one thing is the the um, the expectation that classroom physical activities for teachers versus outside vendors, the research base. So if you look at the whole area of physical activity in the classroom, the majority of studies have been done at universities where, in some case, armies of students, researchers come in, really take over and deliver. There's less research for teacher delivered, where the teacher is trained and then takes over. And I think the analogy is probably going to be the same thing you get with supervised versus unsupervised activity, laboratory versus free living activity. The amount of physical activity delivered seems to diminish. The school culture, the priority is academic learning. There are state standards, there are mission statements, and there are real consequences in terms of funding, in terms of accreditation, which is not there with physical activity. I mentioned teacher training. Can you really expect a regular classroom teacher to design and organize physical activity when they haven't been trained to do so? It might appear simple, but I can tell you anecdotally, this is one of the most frequent comments that we get, that it's just difficult to turn my regular classroom activity into physical activity. And of course, will teachers really be held accountable? In our experience, the answer is no. Slide, please. So we get this comment all the time, and it's becoming rather critical. And that's presenting a teacher with yet another thing to do. The other thing could be a 30-second task, and the reaction is pretty dramatic. They just don't want to do anything more. So you start to wonder, can you really promote physical activity? Is this really a good target when you have these teachers that are constantly overwhelmed? The structure of the school has changed. One can argue a bit of controlled chaos, and that's in a really good site. The variations of the education setting are changing dramatically. The vision that I had, because it's what I experienced, was one teacher, one classroom, the kids stay there, and that's how the learning takes place. Well, this is out the window. Kids go back and forth, leave the classrooms all the time. There are multiple classrooms in open spaces. You have to wonder if it's possible in this environment to deliver physically active lessons when you may be interrupting three other classrooms that are in the same physical space. Excuse me. So we started to look at alternatives, boys and girls clubs, local park and rec departments, where they have a culture of physical activity. Um, Academic adjunct, not the ultimate focus, minimal, no academic governing. That is, these bodies, such as boys and girls clubs, are frequently seen as an adjunct to education, a place where children go after school, but it's not their immediate responsibility. And it's a formula driven daily agenda, which means that there are spots available for certain things, and physical activity is generally one of them. Slide, please. So I thank you very much for your attention. As you know, when you do studies, you don't do these by themselves. And so this is a good portion of our current crew that does all the work. Thank you very much.